Okay, so welcome to part two of this, where we talk about the return stories. I'm a little embarrassed that my time ran out last time. So let me just very quickly finish what I was trying to say. At the end of the war, the surviving Trojan women are given out to the Greek warriors, much in the same way that Briseis was given to Achilles during the raids on Troy. So we find out that Hecuba, the queen of Troy, is given to Odysseus. Cassandra, her daughter, the one who was raped in the temple, is given to Agamemnon. Andromache, Hector's wife, is given to Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. And then Polyxena, who doesn't really play much of a role in the story of Troy, and she's not part of the Iliad, but she is one of the many daughters of Priam and Hecuba. Polyxena is actually sacrificed over Achilles' grave before the Greeks leave to go back home. So you can see in these vase paintings, on the right here, the death of Priam. On the top right, the rape of Cassandra, even though she's kneeling by the feet of Athena. And then on the bottom right, the death of Polyxena, you can see the blood pouring out of her neck as she's being held over the grave of Achilles. Okay, so that's the end of the siege of Troy and the end of the war. So now we're going to move into the return stories. And these have a particular name in Greek. They're called nostoi, Nostoi, nostoi. And nostos, or nostoi, just means returns. There are three main return stories, and we'll talk about them all in batches. The first is what happens to Agamemnon when he gets home. The second is what happens to Menelaus when he gets home. And then the third is Odysseus. And Odysseus, as you know, gets his own epic. So we won't say too much about what happens to him here, but we will spend a little bit of time talking about Agamemnon and Menelaus. Agamemnon and Menelaus' stories are actually preserved in Greek tragedies. So there's a cycle of stories that we can read in a different genre that kind of help us understand the various tensions around their return to their families. But Odysseus' story is largely preserved in the Odyssey, which we'll start reading for Tuesday. So let's start with Agamemnon. Okay, so we're going to go back to this family tree that we first talked about when we talked about the Iliad, where Agamemnon is married to Clytemnestra, one of the sisters of Helen, and they have three children, Iphigenia, Electra, and Orestes. And you'll remember that Iphigenia, his oldest daughter, was the one who was sacrificed in order to make the winds blow and to get the Greeks to Troy. When Agamemnon has been gone, so remember this war lasted 10 years. Remember, Clytemnestra has had some time to think about the fact that Agamemnon has killed her daughter. And during his time away, she also becomes unfaithful to him and begins an affair with Agamemnon's cousin, whose name is Aegisthus. So she and Aegisthus are essentially ruling in their home city of Argos. And Electra and Orestes, her remaining children, live with her there and are conflicted about how they're supposed to feel about the fact that their mother is so hateful towards their father. When Agamemnon returns to Argos, he's also bringing Cassandra with him as his slave. So he's been gone for 10 years, and he shows up with this other woman whom he's been sleeping with. And Clytemnestra is filled with rage for what he's done to her family and for killing her oldest daughter. And so Clytemnestra winds up killing Agamemnon in his bathtub after he's made this long voyage home. And he's in the tub, relaxing and soaking. She kills him, and she also kills Cassandra. So now her children, Electra and Orestes are in an incredibly difficult situation because while they recognize that Agamemnon killed Iphigenia, um, they could possibly explain that away by the fact that he was being commanded by the gods to do this. Uh, but Clytemnestra supposedly had no reason for killing Agamemnon. This wasn't sanctioned by the gods, although they could make the argument that because he killed her daughter, she herself was honor bound to kill him. But more to the point, uh, the children are now in this situation where they have to decide whether or not they have to kill Clytemnestra because Clytemnestra killed their father. So are they obligated to take vengeance for their father who was murdered by the will of Clytemnestra, not by the will of the gods? And there's a series of stories that tells this particular part of the saga that we call the Oresteia. And without getting into, without getting into too many details, what we can say is that Agamemnon's son, Orestes, feels the burden of having to avenge his death and goes through a very difficult journey. He has to decide whether or not he's going to actually kill his mother. And then once he does make that decision, he has to live with it and come to grips with the fact that he has killed his own mother, his family member, and that's an action that's hateful to the gods. And he has to be essentially purified by the gods and forgiven by the gods for what he felt like he was forced to do. It's a very complicated story. It's a very rich story, which unfortunately we don't have more time to delve into. But that's our first return. So Agamemnon's return was especially gruesome and especially grisly. So our next return is Menelaus' return. Now, as you recall, the whole reason why this war even began was Menelaus' wife, Helen, leaves him for whatever reason. In the Iliad, we get the sense that she went willingly. And Menelaus kind of enacts or activates this oath that all of the Greek men took to protect her honor and leads this 10-year-long war in an effort to get her back. So at the end of the war, Helen is indeed still alive, and Menelaus does recover her and decides to bring her back to Sparta with him. Now, I'm truncating a lot of information. This, too, was the subject of a couple of different Greek tragedies that explore what Helen does to convince Menelaus to take her back, and Menelaus' mindset, how he reacts to her, what he thinks of her, while making this decision. Either way, they get into their ship and they start making their way back to Sparta. And along the way, they're shipwrecked. And they wind up washing up in Egypt. And they are stuck. They don't know where they are. And they wind up trapping one of the sea gods named Proteus and essentially forcing him to give them the information that they need to get home and eventually they do make it back to Sparta. Now, interestingly, there's also a version of the story where Helen actually never went to Troy, right? That Helen herself was left behind in Egypt, and that a cloud Helen, a Helen made of wisps and the stuff of gods, is actually sent to Troy to be the catalyst for the war. And it's only when Menelaus is washed up on the shores of Egypt that he finds the real Helen on his way back home. So this is one of those kooky variants of the myth that throw the whole rationale for the war into question and really tries to change the way that we think about the character of Helen. So we don't really need to understand that so much for the return story, so much as it's just an interesting way that the Greeks continue to tell the story over time to change the way that we understand and that we think about how the story is supposed to work. So that brings us to the Odyssey, this new epic about the return of Odysseus. And so let's just do a quick reminder of Odysseus and his family. So we'll remember that he brokered his marriage to Penelope by coming up with the Oath of Tyndareus to make sure that Helen is safely married. Odysseus and Penelope live on this tiny rocky island off the northwest coast of Greece called Ithaca. And by the time the war begins, they have a young son named Telemachus. He's a baby. He's not that old, but that means that by the time Odysseus returns, he is most definitely a man. So the Odyssey presents us with two distinct timelines. Right? One is what's happening with Odysseus during the war and his attempt to return home, and one is what's happening in Ithaca while Odysseus is gone. So if we look at what's going on with Odysseus, we know from the Iliad and from the stories that happen after the Iliad that Odysseus is gone for 10 years just fighting. What we're going to learn from the Odyssey is that it also takes him 10 years to get back home. So 3 of those years he's lost at sea, and for 7 years he winds up living on an island with a nymph named Calypso. And it's not until he finally separates from her and decides to go home that he actually returns. Now, in Ithaca, things are a little bit more complicated as they are over roughly 20 years. So Telemachus is growing up and he's a young man by the time the story begins. His mother, Odysseus' mother, Anticlea, dies while he's gone, and his father, Laertes, has essentially withdrawn from their home, and he works out in their vineyards in Ithaca and doesn't really interact in Ithacan life. Telemachus and Penelope are managing their house, and they've got this huge group of men who are living in the house on the pretense of courting Penelope. So we call these men the suitors because they are all working under the assumption that Odysseus has died, because it's been nearly 20 years since he's been heard from, and that Penelope, who now essentially owns all of his holdings, the king's holdings, needs to get remarried. And they are all there to press their suit, right, to make the case that they should be the new king of Ithaca. So you can think about the dangerous situation of all of Helen's suitors being in the same place, right? And the delay that Tyndareus made in making a decision for Helen and how dangerous that became. We have a similar situation in Ithaca where Penelope is delaying making this decision, but it's becoming more and more dangerous. And the suitors themselves recognize that because Telemachus is growing up and getting to the point where he himself can inherit the kingship, they threaten to kill him. But before this happens, Telemachus decides he is ready to strike out and try to figure out what's happened to his father, to see if they can't bring him home to help take care of this situation. So we are going to pause here and end the second bit of this story, and then the last thing we'll talk about will be the Odyssey itself, the structure, and what we can expect from it.